Good morning, everybody. Do we have anybody here that's in college right now? Anyone? Anyone at all? Oh, we got one back there. That's what I'm talking about. So I just want to start out by telling you that if you guys ever need encouragement or need to know that the impossible can be done, get to know a college kid. And I'm talking like your average college kid, the one that's a procrastinator that waits till the very last second to get everything done. And I was just and I was thinking to myself this when I was writing this, because I was looking back on my Monday of Dead Week, the week before finals, one of the worst times of the year. Anyone who's ever been a procrastinator in college knows exactly what I'm talking about. See, we all know that everything is due that Friday, and as I was counting up the things that I needed to get done, I counted one quiz, two papers, a research paper that was worth half of my grade, 2 or 3 tests, a family tree thingy, and all of these other things, and I'm starting to wonder to myself, am I ever going to get this done? And then my professor, while I'm sitting in my Old Testament class, drops this bomb. He tells us we're going to start presenting our final projects on Friday. And so 2 lucky groups are going to be chosen to present their final project on Friday, which me and my partner and I, of course, had not even thought about. And as we start to go through how this selection is going to be accomplished, we have one person who volunteers as tribute, which means it leaves 4 groups fighting tooth and nail to not have to present on Friday. And so we literally had the first annual Hunger Games in my class that day. And how we did this was of casting of lots, or in his case, pick a number between 1 and 20, and the closest to that number is safe. And so the first round goes, and everyone picks a number. My partner, of course, he picks 15, I think is what it was, and the number was 3. So there goes another group that's out, they're safe, but I'm still in. And this goes on for quite a while. Through the first rounds, the number is always like 1 or 2 or 3, and my partner, of course, keeps going high. And then we get to the final fateful round. He says, pick a number between 1 and 20. And my partner, bless his heart, listens to the whole classroom and says, pick 10. Then they'll have to choose a side. But everybody and their mother and their father and everybody else knew that the number was going to be high. If he said the number is low all the way through, he picks 10. And the other group picks 11, and the number was 18. And it was in that moment I just dropped my head in my hands. And I'm thinking to myself, man, I wasn't that bad of a server, was I? I mean, it's not too late to go back. I mean, I'm only like a couple, 10, 30 grand in debt right now. It's fine. And so I was feeling the stress that most people feel during this last week of finals, and as I worked through, I ended up at 11:59 p.m. on Friday, was able to turn everything in. It may not be the best grades I've ever had, but it's done. And it was in this moment that I thought it was impossible, and I remember the words of what the class person, the college minister, said during class on Wednesday. He said the easiest way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. Sometimes you might have to eat it quite quickly, and I did eat quickly. But we got it all done. And this morning I want to talk about an impossible situation. A situation that seemed impossible, and today I want us to think about a moment when we ourselves were in a situation that seemed quite impossible, that we could not see a way out of this. And I want us to remember what we did when we were in this situation, and remember the time that we were able to make it out of the situation. We're still here today. So to start by doing this, I want to read for us a little bit of the covenant of God that made with Abram in Genesis 15. So if you'll turn with me in your Bibles to Genesis 15. So we're going to be looking at Genesis 15, 1 through 6 to start, and we will ultimately end up in Genesis 16 for the rest of this morning. So Genesis 15, starting in verse 1, it says, "After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward.' But Abram said, 'Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer,' or however you say that, 'of Damascus.' And Abram said, 'You have given me no children. So a servant in my household will be my heir.' Then the word of the Lord came to him, 'This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir.' He took him outside and said, 'Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them all.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.' Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness." So the first thing we see is God says to Abram, "Do not be afraid, for I am your shield, your very great reward." Basically what God is telling him is telling Abram, look, I am great, and I am perfect, and I am enough to get you through all struggles in life. And the problem is, Abram is getting closer to the prime age of 90, as we'll see in our reading today. He's around 86, 85 at this moment. And so he's getting up there in age. And so he realizes, though, at his old age that he's still missing one thing. And this is the one thing that would make sense if you're going to be great and the Lord is going to push you through. You might need an heir. And so Abram does not see how God is going to do great things in his life because he cannot see past the fact that he remains childless and his wife remains barren. And so God comes and takes him, and he says, "This man, Eliezer, this servant in your household, he will not be your heir, but a son of your own flesh and blood will be your heir." And to make this even more believable for you, I'm going to take you outside, and I want you to look up in the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, so as numerous will your people be. And it's with this background that we arrive at our text for today. So now if we'll look over to Genesis 16. We're going to look at verses 1 through 3 to start out, and we're going to continue on from there. So Genesis 16, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her.' Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife." So when we read this, the first thing that we see is something so grotesque, something so taboo in our time. The idea of having one's wife taking anyone, because she cannot have children, to her husband so that this slave in this instance would conceive. And for us, that's not something we can relate to, because that's something that seems way out there and so wrong. But in our age of this time, it's actually quite surprising. There are marriage contracts from the era of a town called Nuzai during the 2nd century BC, which stipulated that if the wife turned out to be barren, she would provide her husband a surrogate child bearer. And one contract reads, it says, if Galimenu, I cannot pronounce these names, so I apologize. Galimenu bears children, then Shimei shall not take another wife. But if Galimenu fails to bear children, Galimenu shall get for Shimei a woman from the Lul's country, a slave girl as a concubine. In that case, Galimenu herself shall have authority over the offspring. So this, when we read this, then we can see quite exactly that this is exactly what's going on in our text today. Is Sarai is fulfilling what most would call her duty, which is if she's barren, is to provide her husband somebody to have children for him and then she would of course be by law, I guess, the mother of this child, even though it is not hers, but it is her duty to her husband to fulfill this. So Sarai gives her husband Hagar, and we see that he agrees. And then as we continue reading verses from 4 and 6, it says, he slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Hagar said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms. And now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So Hagar ends up becoming pregnant. So for a younger generation, the baby stork is getting ready to drop off a child through the chimney. And so she's starting to feel a little bit conceited because she is to bear this child, which God seemed to have promised Abram that he will have a son, and this will be his heir. And so Hagar starts to believe that she is divine appointed or whatever, not saying that the baby is God, but what I'm saying is this is a baby that was promised from God. And so she becomes pregnant, and she starts to despise, or in some commentary said that she started to believe that she was above Sarai because Sarai was barren. And so Sarai comes to Abram, and she tells him, you did not do what you were supposed to do, because the law, as we read, stipulates that this is to be Sarai's child by law. And so Hagar was supposed to, once she became pregnant and then she conceived, she was supposed to go back to being a slave girl. But Abram was so excited about being a father that he forgot to do this. And so Hagar was left unchecked. And so Sarai comes to Abram and says, may the Lord judge me and you for what we have done. And Abram, of course, he tries to play it safe, and so he does not do exactly what he's supposed to do. And so he leaves the solution or the punishment or whatever it may be in Sarai's hands. He says, this is your slave, so you go and take care of this. And so, leaving it in Sarai's hand, his very angry wife, she abuses her, or treats her poorly, as our text says, and she flees. And well, where would she be fleeing to? Well, it's quite possible, since she is an Egyptian slave, she would be fleeing back to the only place that she's ever known, and that's Egypt. And so as she's fleeing there, she is fleeing for her life. We continue on reading verses 7 through 16. It says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. Then the angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant And and you shall give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael. For the Lord, he heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. This is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael. So the text says there's the angel of the Lord comes to find her, a messenger from God, and he asks, where have you come from and where are you going? And Hagar says, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. Or in our terms, I'm fleeing from this crazy woman who wants to kill me because I did what she asked me to do. The angel then gives her this crazy advice and says, go back to your mistress and submit. And I believe quite quickly he probably adds in, and I will make your descendants as too numerous to count as well. And then the angel tells her about what her son will be. And as we relook through verses 11 through 12, it says, the angel also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. So you will have a son, and you shall name him Ishmael. For the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. See, the son that she is to bear, would become later the father of Islam. And this son would live in hostility to all of his brothers. Isaac, which is the father of, which is Abram, which is like the father of Judaism and stuff. But for this reason, that he would live in hostility with all of his brothers, a lot of them considering, if we look at them, it would be Christianity, Judaism, and there would be many wars that would be fought from this one moment. Have you ever heard of wars such as the Crusades, maybe the constant struggle between Pakistan and Israel? It all seems to start from this moment, from this child that Hagar would bear, who would later become the father of Islam. And so then after this, Hagar goes back and submits to her mistress, and she bears a son, and she names him Ishmael. But also one thing I want us to take a look at is in this text, something very interesting happens here. This is the first time in the biblical narrative, and might be the only time in the biblical narrative, I'm not sure, don't quote me on that, but I know it's the first time that somebody gives a name to God. She gives him the name, you are the God who sees me. This is a God who saw a woman who was fleeing for her life, a woman who was in agony, who was in pain, who was in deep distress. He saw her pain, he saw her agony, and he came to her rescue. And the story, of course, ends with her giving the son to Abram and naming him Ishmael. But there's a massive struggle that I want us to understand in this narrative. So this is a narrative of a man who could not see how the promise that he had been given could ever be to come to fulfillment. Neither could his wife. So they decided, instead of walking by faith, they decided they would step out of faith and step into what most would consider logical. If your wife cannot have a child and you're supposed to be this great nation, well, obviously there has to be something else that has to be done, because that's the only thing that makes logical sense, is to step out of what God would say and step into what is logical. See, the biggest problem here is that Abram seemed to have forgotten what God had told him. He says, if we remember back to our covenant reading in chapter 15, he said, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I am your shield, your very great reward." I believe what he forgot was this is the same God who was the one who saved him and kept him alive in his struggles in Egypt that we talked about last week. This is the same God who is bigger than his fears, who has been there and helped lead him to this point. He seemed to have forgotten who exactly he was dealing with. He could not see how Sarai was the one to be chosen for his heir to come through. And the truth is even when Abram stepped out of faith and stepped into what I would like to call logic, God still provided. See, we will read more, and then the very next chapter we see this covenant of circumcision, and there's a point in there where God tells him that continues on with your descendants will be numerous as the stars, and he says, he's like, thank goodness I have Ishmael, but what God says is, Hagar will not be the one through the child in which your heirs will come from. See, my promise and everything that will come into fulfillment will be from Sarai. And as we see later, we'll see the story of Isaac and how this fulfills the promise of God. Here's the thing is, I believe that we can learn a lot from the words that God said to Abram. Do not be afraid, for I am your shield, your great reward. These are the same promises that he tells us. And when we step into life and we realize that times are hard, or for me, whenever you're a procrastinator or whatever it may be, he says, do not be afraid. Whenever we step into moments where we don't understand how we're going to make it through and how anything could ever come to completion, when the promise of God seems unattainable, we need to understand that he says, do not be afraid, for I am your shield, your great reward. So maybe we need to start stepping out by faith and understanding that the same call he gave to Abram is the same call that he gives us, to not be afraid, to understand that he is our shield, that he sent his son to die for us, so that way we might be protected. And the only call, the only answer is to step out by faith and to reach out to those who do not know him, because he is our shield. He will keep us safe. And he will not let us fail, because we all have a mission. Let's pray. Father, I pray that we understand that you are great. Father, I pray that when we see immovable walls, when we see mountains that are too massive for us to climb, may we remember that you are great. You are our shield. We shall not be afraid, for you are our great reward. You have sent Jesus so that we may have life. Father, may we always remember that your promises are perfect, and you will fulfill our promises, and you will keep us safe. And it may not be in the moment we want, but it will be in the moment that we need him. So, Father, may we always remember that you are great, and you will be with us through it all. It's in Jesus' name, amen. So maybe there's somebody here today who realizes that they do not have a relationship with God, and they want to step into the promise that for us to not be afraid, because that God is our shield, our great reward. And we want that. And so maybe today, this is the day that you step into the calling, and what he tells us and what he tells you is, do not be afraid, for he is your shield, your very great reward. So today, I call you to step into that relationship. And for some of us also, maybe we need to be reminded that he is great and he is big enough for our struggles and trials. And he will help guide us through and he will bring us home. And so if there's anything that this church can do for you, please come as we stand and as we sing.